In the parched heart of 1880s Kansas, where mercy was as scarce as rain, a pregnant widow named Willa Garner stood on her porch, watching the bankmen load her belongings into their wagon. Her husband's grave was still fresh earth, and her baby wasn't due for 2 months, but the land was already lost. She had begged, pleaded, even offered to work without wages, but Samuel Whitmore's bank had no patience for widows or sob stories. The deed was forfeit, the decision final. As tears mixed with dust on her cheeks, Willa prepared to face the world, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a child growing in her belly. Then a shadow fell across her doorway. Elias Crow, the silent rancher from the neighboring spread, stood there, holding a worn envelope. Without a word, he placed it in her trembling hands. But what secret from Elias's past would make him risk everything to save a woman he barely knew? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Kansas plains stretched endlessly under a pewter sky, where clouds promised rain but delivered only disappointment. The year was 1884, and the drought had lasted 3 seasons too long. What had once been emerald wheat fields now lay barren, cracked earth that split like broken hearts under the relentless sun. In this unforgiving landscape, the small farming community of Cedar Ridge clung to existence with the stubborn determination of prairie grass. Bent but not broken, weathered but still rooted, Willa Garner's fingers traced the smooth gold band on her ring finger. Thomas's wedding ring that she now wore on a chain around her neck. The metal was warm against her skin, a constant reminder of the man who had promised her forever, but had only managed 18 months. Thomas had been everything the prairie demanded, strong, steady, and unafraid of hard work. He'd courted her with wildflower bouquets and promises of a farm that would flourish even in the hardest times. She'd believed him then, watching his calloused hands plant seeds with the faith of a man who knew spring always followed winter. Their small farmhouse sat like a weathered sentinel against the endless horizon, its white paint peeling and shutters hanging askew from the constant wind. The wraparound porch, where they'd spent summer evenings planning their future, now sagged under the weight of neglect. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of afternoon light that filtered through windows she no longer had the energy to wash. The kitchen, where she'd learned to make Thomas's favorite cornbread, now held only empty shelves and the ghost of better times. Thomas had died as he lived, working the land he loved. The fever had come quick and merciless, burning through him like prairie fire. In 3 days, she'd gone from wife to widow, from partner to solitary guardian of dreams that felt too big for one person to carry. The baby growing beneath her heart was his final gift, a piece of him she could hold on to when everything else slipped away like sand through desperate fingers. Doc Henley had been the one to break the news about the bank's intentions. He'd sat in her kitchen, his weathered face grave, as he explained how Thomas had taken a loan against the farm to buy seed for the spring planting. Seed that never grew in soil too dry to nurture hope. Samuel Whitmore had given her 3 months to come. Up with the money, a gesture he'd called generous, but which felt more like cruelty wrapped in false kindness. "You're carrying precious cargo, Willa," Doc had said, his voice gentle as he checked on her condition. "That baby needs a mama who isn't worrying herself into an early grave." But worry was all she had left. Worry and the increasingly awkward bulk of pregnancy that made even simple tasks feel mountainous. Martha Sullivan from the neighboring farm had tried to help, bringing soup and attempting to lift Willa's spirits with gossip and determined cheer. Martha was a sturdy woman, with greying hair and hands that spoke of a lifetime spent wresting sustenance from stubborn soil. She'd raised 6 children and buried 2 husbands, giving her a practical wisdom about survival that Willa desperately needed. "There's talk in town," Martha had whispered during one of her visits, glancing around as if Samuel Whitmore himself might be lurking behind the curtains. "Folks saying Whitmore's been buying up every failed farm for pennies, then selling. them to those railroad men from back east, making himself rich while good families lose everything they've worked for. The knowledge sat bitter in Willa's stomach. She wasn't the only one facing this fate, just the most vulnerable. A pregnant widow with no family and no means was an easy target, a problem to be solved quickly and quietly. The other struggling farmers at least had sons to work the land or relatives who could take them in. Willa had only the child she carried and memories that felt increasingly fragile. Thomas's unfinished projects haunted every corner of the house. The half-built addition meant to be a nursery stood like a skeleton against the south wall. Its frame, naked to the elements. Tools lay where he'd dropped them, covered now in dust and rust. His favorite shirt still hung on the bedpost, and sometimes she caught herself reaching for it in the pre-dawn darkness, expecting to find him there, beside her. The isolation was perhaps the hardest part. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, and with her condition making travel difficult, days passed without seeing another soul. She talked to the baby sometimes, one hand resting on her swollen belly as she shared memories of his father or read aloud from the few books that had survived. Their lean times. The child responded with kicks and movement that both comforted and reminded her of how unprepared she was for what lay ahead. When the final notice came from the bank, crisp and official and final as a gravestone inscription, Willa had read it. 3 times before the words penetrated: eviction, foreclosure, 30 days to vacate. The legal language made her situation sound clean and businesslike, but there was nothing clean about losing everything you'd ever called home. 3 miles, east of Willa's struggling farm, where the land rolled into gentle swells like a vast green ocean frozen in time, stood the Crow Ranch. It was a prosperous spread by any measure, with sturdy fences, well-maintained buildings, and cattle that somehow found enough grass to stay fat even in the worst of the drought. Yet, for all its success, the ranch felt as isolated as a ship adrift, its owner a mystery wrapped in silence and shadow. Elias Crow moved through his morning routine with the precision of a man who'd long ago decided that order was the only defense against chaos. He rose before dawn, fed the horses, checked the water troughs, and inspected fence lines with methodical thoroughness. His hands, scarred and weathered from years of hard work, performed each task with quiet efficiency. Those who knew him, which was precious few, understood that his silence wasn't rudeness, but something deeper, a withdrawal from the world that seemed as natural to him as breathing. The ranch house itself reflected its owner's nature. Built solid and functional, it lacked the feminine touches that might have made it a home rather than merely a shelter. No curtains softened the windows, no flowers brightened the porch, no photographs adorned the mantel. The only decoration was a faded daguerreotype that Elias kept hidden in the bottom drawer of his desk, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth like a precious relic. The photograph showed 2 young soldiers in Union blue, arms draped around each other's shoulders with the easy camaraderie of men who'd shared danger and survived to tell about it. One was clearly Elias, though younger, and wearing an expression of openness that his current face no longer possessed. The other soldier had kind eyes and a gentle smile, the face of a man who believed in goodness even in the midst of war's horrors. On the back, in fading ink, someone had written, Elias and Thomas, Antietam, September 1862. In town, folks had their theories about Elias Crow's past. Some said he'd been a gunfighter who'd hung up his holsters and tried to go respectable. Others whispered that he'd killed a man in a duel back east and fled west to escape the law. The more charitable souls suggested he'd simply lost a woman to another man and never recovered from the heartbreak. All the theories shared one common thread. They recognized that whatever had shaped Elias into the man he'd become had left wounds that ran deeper than flesh. The truth was both simpler and more complex than any of the town's speculation. Elias carried the war with him still, not in his body, but in his soul. He'd seen things at Antietam, at Gettysburg, at Chancellorsville that had carved pieces from his heart and left him unable to trust in the permanence of anything good. He'd learned that men who laughed with you at breakfast could be cold meat by supper time, that causes you'd die for could crumble like morning mist, that the only safety lay in expecting nothing and protecting what little you could control. The ranch had been his refuge, a place where he could impose order on at least one small corner of the world. He'd built it with his own hands, every board and nail placed with the deliberate care of a man who needed to believe that something could last. His cattle thrived because he watched over them with the vigilance of a sentry. His crops grew because he tended them with the patience of a man who understood that some things couldn't be rushed. His land prospered because he gave it the attention he'd once given to keeping his fellow soldiers alive. But prosperity couldn't fill the silence that had settled over his life like dust over an abandoned house. He ate his meals alone, worked his land alone, and went to sleep each night in a bed that felt as vast and empty as the prairie sky. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, he'd take out the photograph and study the faces of two young men who'd believed they were going to change the world. He'd wonder what Thomas would think of the man his friend had become. Successful but solitary, secure but somehow diminished. The closest Elias came to human connection was his weekly trips to town for supplies. He'd nod to the shopkeepers, pay his bills in cash, and listen to the local gossip without contributing to it. People had learned not to expect conversation from Elias Crow, though they'd noticed he always paid fairly and never caused trouble. He was the kind of neighbor you could trust, but never really know, reliable as sunrise, but distant as the mountains. It was on one of these supply runs that he'd first heard about Thomas Garner's death. The news had hit him like a physical blow. Though his face had shown nothing to the men discussing it outside Morrison's general store. Later, alone in his wagon on the ride home, he'd gripped the reins so tightly his knuckles went white as he processed the information that his oldest friend, the only man who'd truly known him, was gone. That night, for the first time in years, Elias had taken out a bottle of whiskey and drunk until the photograph stopped looking back at him with reproachful eyes. Cedar Ridge sat like a collection of children's blocks scattered across the prairie, its buildings huddled together as if seeking protection from the endless wind and sky. Main Street stretched exactly 4 blocks from the railroad depot at the south end to the white-steepled church at the north, with businesses crowding both sides like spectators at a parade. The town had been born of hope and necessity when the railroad pushed through 10 years earlier, and it had grown with the stubborn persistence of prairie grass, sending down roots whether the soil welcomed them or not. Samuel Whitmore's bank occupied the most prominent corner of Main and First, a 2-story brick building that stood out among the wooden storefronts like a lord among peasants. Whitmore had designed it that way intentionally, wanting everyone who entered his domain to understand exactly who held the power in Cedar Ridge. The brass nameplate on his office door read, "President and Chairman," though locals joked behind. His back, that emperor, would be more accurate. Inside his mahogany-paneled office, Whitmore kept meticulous records in leather-bound ledgers that told the story of the town's financial life in columns of careful script. Each entry represented someone's dreams, a loan for seed money, a mortgage on a family farm, a promissory note for store inventory. But to Whitmore, they were simply numbers, assets to be managed, and profits to be maximized. His particular ledger, the one he kept locked in his private safe, contained a different kind of record entirely. This special ledger tracked what Whitmore privately called his acquisition program. Each page documented a struggling farm, its debt structure, the family's vulnerabilities, and his strategy for eventually claiming the property. The Garner farm occupied 3 full pages, with detailed notes about Thomas's death, Willa's pregnancy, and her complete lack of resources or family support. Beside her name, in red ink, Whitmore had written, "Priority acquisition, Railroad interest confirmed. The railroad connection was the key to everything. Eastern investors, backed by railroad money, were quietly buying up failed farms throughout Kansas, consolidating small holdings into vast ranches that could supply cattle to the growing cities back east. Whitmore served as their local agent, using his position at the bank to identify vulnerable properties and orchestrate their acquisition at rock-bottom prices. He took his commission in cash and land, slowly building his own empire while maintaining the facade of a concerned community leader. The irony wasn't lost on him that his success came from other people's failures. Every drought, every crop failure, every family tragedy translated into opportunity for those with capital and patience. He'd learned long ago that sentiment was a luxury that poor men couldn't afford, and Samuel Whitmore had no intention of ever being poor again. His own childhood memories of want and humiliation had hardened into a shell of ambition that no amount of success could crack. At Morrison's General Store, the hub of local gossip and commerce, folks gathered each morning to discuss the weather, the crops, and their neighbors' business with equal intensity. Old Jake Morrison, who'd run the store since Cedar Ridge was nothing but a depot and 3 buildings, served as the unofficial keeper of the town's collective memory. His store was crammed floor to ceiling with everything from penny candy to farm equipment, and he prided himself on knowing exactly what each customer needed before they asked for it. "That Whitmore's been busy as a bee in clover," Jake confided to his regular customers, his voice carrying the authority of a man who heard everything and forgot nothing. "You heard tell he's bought up the Patterson place, the old Schmidt farm, and now he's got his sights set on the Garner spread. Seems mighty eager to help a widow in her time of need, if you catch my meaning." The customers caught his meaning perfectly. In a community where everyone knew everyone else's business, Whitmore's sudden interest in helping struggling farmers was viewed with the suspicion it deserved. Folks had watched good families lose everything while Whitmore somehow managed to end up with their land at sheriff's auctions, always bidding just enough to win, but never so much as to seem greedy. Dr. Henry Henley made his rounds between the bank and the general store, moving with the measured pace of a man who'd learned that most of life's emergencies weren't really emergencies at all. As the town's only physician, he served as confessor, counselor, and witness to Cedar Ridge's private struggles. His black medical bag contained more than pills and instruments. It held the secrets and sorrows of nearly every family in the county. Doc Henley had delivered half the children in town, set their broken bones, and closed their eyes when their time came. He'd seen how quickly prosperity could turn to poverty, how a single season of bad luck could destroy a lifetime of work. That's why Willa Garner's situation troubled him so deeply. She was a good woman, facing impossible circumstances, and the vultures were already circling. At Mabel's Cafe, where the coffee was strong and the pie was legendary, the conversation flowed as freely as the coffee refills. Mabel herself was a mountain of a woman with arms like tree trunks and a heart bigger than her considerable frame. She'd fed half the town through the worst of the drought, extending credit to families who had nowhere else to turn, and somehow managing to keep her own doors open through sheer force of will and community support. "Mark my words," Mabel declared as she refilled coffee cups with practiced efficiency, "that Whitmore's up to no good. No banker gets that rich in a poor county without stepping on some toes along the way. And now he's got his eye on that poor Garner girl, her barely able to get around with that baby coming and nowhere to turn for help." The assembled diners nodded their agreement, but their sympathy was tempered by their own struggles. Times were hard for everyone, and while they felt for Willa's plight, few had the resources to offer more than moral support. That was the harsh arithmetic of frontier life. Survival often meant looking after your own first and hoping there'd be something left over for your neighbors. The morning of the eviction dawned grey and merciless, with clouds that promised rain, but delivered only false hope. Willa had spent the sleepless night packing her few remaining possessions into 2 battered suitcases and a wooden crate that had once held Thomas's books. Each item she touched carried a memory. The china teacup. From their wedding, the quilt her mother had sewn. The tin daguerreotype of Thomas in his Sunday best. How do you pack a life into containers small enough for one woman to carry? Samuel Whitmore arrived promptly at 9 o'clock, accompanied by Sheriff Davies and 2 men with a wagon. The banker wore his best suit and a satisfied expression that made Willa's stomach turn. He carried a leather portfolio containing what he called the necessary documentation, though everyone present understood it was really a death certificate for her dreams. "Mrs. Garner," Whitmore said with false courtesy, tipping his hat as he approached the porch. "I trust you've had adequate time to prepare for the transition. My men will be respectful of your belongings, naturally." Willa stood in her doorway, one hand resting on her swollen belly and the other gripping the doorframe for support. At 7 months pregnant, even standing for long periods exhausted her, but she refused to show weakness to this man who'd shown her none. "I understand your position, Mr. Whitmore, but surely there's some accommodation we can reach. I'm willing to work, to pay what I can." "Business is business, my dear," Whitmore interrupted, his tone suggesting the matter was closed. "The bank has been more than patient given your circumstances. But patience has its limits, and we have other obligations to consider." Sheriff Davies looked uncomfortable with his role in the proceedings. He was a decent man, caught between duty and conscience, and everyone could see the conflict playing across his weathered features. "Ma'am, I'm truly sorry about this, but the law's the law. The bank has every right to reclaim property when payments ain't made." The 2 hired men began loading Willa's possessions into their wagon with mechanical efficiency. They handled her things carelessly, and she winced as she heard the china teacup rattle in its wrapping. These were strangers touching the remnants of her life, reducing her existence to cargo to be hauled away. That's when the shadow fell across her doorway. Elias Crow stood there like a figure from a dream, tall and solid, and somehow reassuring despite his reputation for silence. He wore his working clothes, denim pants, cotton shirt, and boots caked with honest dirt. But there was something different about his posture, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. In his weathered hands, he held a manila envelope that looked official and important. "Morning, Mrs. Garner," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd made up his mind about something. He nodded politely to the other men, but his attention remained focused on Willa. "Brought you something that might be of interest." Whitmore stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the unexpected visitor. "Mr. Crow, isn't it? I believe. This is a private matter between the bank and Mrs. Garner. Your presence here isn't required." Elias turned his attention to the banker with the slow deliberation of a man considering his words carefully. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but carried an edge that made everyone present suddenly alert. "Reckon it's private until it affects the neighborhood. This here's neighborhood business now." Without further explanation, Elias extended the envelope toward Willa. She took it with trembling fingers, noting how warm it was from his hands and how carefully he'd prepared it. The envelope was thick with documents, and her name was written across the front in careful script. Inside, she found papers that made no immediate sense, legal documents with official seals and flowing language that seemed too good to be true. But as her eyes focused on the key phrases, the impossible became real. Deed of transfer. Full ownership conveyed. All debts satisfied. Willa May Garner, sole proprietor. The land deed was there, genuine and properly notarized, transferring full ownership of her farm from the bank to her personally. Every debt was marked paid in full in bold letters across the original loan documents. At the bottom of the deed, Elias Crow's signature appeared as the purchasing party, though his name nowhere appeared as a claimant to the property. "I don't understand," Willa whispered, looking up at Elias with wonder and confusion warring in her expression. "How is this possible? I can't accept already done," Elias said simply. Papers are filed proper at the county courthouse. Bank's been paid, debts clear, land's yours free and clear. Whitmore snatched the documents from Willa's hands, his face darkening as he scanned the legal language. This is impossible. You can't just... The bank has rights. There are procedures, all proper procedures followed, Elias replied calmly. Cash payment, full documentation, legal transfer. Unless you're saying your bank don't honor its own contracts. The silence that followed Elias's revelation stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Whitmore stood frozen, the deed trembling in his hands as his face cycled through expressions of disbelief, rage, and calculation. Sheriff Davies removed his hat and scratched his head, clearly out of his depth in matters that involved more law than he was comfortable navigating. The two hired men looked between their employer and the tall rancher, unsure whether they should continue loading the wagon or start unloading it. "This is preposterous," Whitmore finally sputtered, his composure cracking like ice in spring. No one simply buys another person's debt without notice, without negotiation. There are proper channels, established procedures, all followed to the letter, Elias replied with the patience of a man explaining something obvious to a slow child. Your bank advertised the debt for sale in the county newspaper, as required. By law, I responded with a cash offer that exceeded the outstanding balance. Your clerk processed the transaction yesterday afternoon. Everything's legal and binding. Willa sank onto her porch steps, the weight of the moment making her legs unsteady. The baby inside her seemed to sense her emotional upheaval, kicking restlessly against her ribs as if sharing her confusion. She stared at the documents in Whitmore's hands, papers that represented not just her home, but her future and her child's. Inheritance. That a virtual stranger had secured these things for her seemed impossible, yet here was the proof in black ink and official seals. "Why?" she whispered, the word barely audible above the prairie wind. "Mr. Crow, I don't understand why you would do such a thing. I can't possibly repay you." "No repayment needed," Elias said, his eyes meeting hers briefly before sliding away. "Consider it a neighborly gesture. Prairie's hard enough without good folks losing their homes to—" He paused, his gaze shifting to Whitmore with unmistakable meaning. "To circumstances beyond their control." In Thomas's unfinished workshop, visible through the open barn doors, sat the cradle he'd been building when the fever took him. The wood was weathered now, the joints loose from exposure to the elements, but the love that had shaped each careful cut remained evident in every curve and angle. Thomas had spent his evenings there, planning for a child he'd never meet, crafting a place where his son or daughter would sleep safely. Now, thanks to a silent rancher's inexplicable generosity, that cradle might actually fulfill its purpose. Whitmore thrust the papers back toward Willa with barely controlled fury. "This isn't over, Mrs. Garner. Legal complications have a way of arising in cases like this. Property disputes, title questions, tax assessments. There are many ways a situation can become difficult." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire, obvious to everyone present. Sheriff Davies shifted uncomfortably, clearly wanting no part in whatever scheme the banker was contemplating. Elias, however, seemed unperturbed by the implied menace. If anything, his posture relaxed slightly, like a man settling in for a conversation he'd been expecting. "Appreciate the warning," Elias said mildly. "Course, I imagine the county prosecutor might be interested to hear about banks that don't honor their own legal contracts. Bad for business confidence, I'd think. Might even attract attention from those railroad investors I hear you've been working with." The color drained from Whitmore's face so quickly it was almost comical. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Elias knew about the banker's private arrangements, and he wasn't afraid to use that knowledge. In a community where reputation meant everything, the suggestion of impropriety could destroy a man's livelihood faster than drought could kill crops. "You boys can head back to town," Sheriff Davies announced, clearly eager to extract himself from the deteriorating situation. Looks like there won't be any eviction today after all. Mrs. Garner, my apologies for the inconvenience." As the wagon rumbled away with its cargo of disappointed authority, Willa found herself alone with her mysterious benefactor. Elias stood awkwardly by his horse, his hands busy with the reins in a way that suggested he was as uncomfortable with gratitude as she was with accepting charity. The silence between them felt different now. Not the empty quiet of strangers, but the weighted pause of two people trying to understand what had just passed between them. "Mr. Crow," she began, then stopped, overwhelmed by the inadequacy of words. "How do you thank someone for saving your entire world? How do you express gratitude for kindness so unexpected it felt like witnessing a miracle?" "Elias," he corrected quietly, "and no thanks needed, just take care of yourself and that baby. Prairie's got enough sadness without adding to it." He mounted his horse with practiced ease, but before riding away he turned back to look at her one more time. In that brief glance, Willa glimpsed something she hadn't expected, not the satisfaction of good deed accomplished, but the profound loneliness of a man who'd just given away something precious and had nowhere to go with the emptiness it left behind. 3 days passed before Willa could bring herself to bake the apple pie. She'd risen each morning with the intention of thanking Elias properly for his extraordinary kindness, but each time she'd find herself paralyzed by the magnitude of what he'd done. How do you repay a man who'd saved not just your home, but your future? What words could possibly encompass such gratitude? The apples had come from her own small orchard, the only trees on the property that had somehow survived both drought and neglect. Thomas had planted them the spring after their wedding, joking that they'd have apple pie for their golden anniversary. Now, as she carefully peeled each piece of fruit, Willa found herself thinking about the bitter irony of baking with his apples for another man, a man whose motives remained as mysterious as morning mist. Her kitchen filled with the warm scents of cinnamon and sugar as the pie baked, and for the first time since Thomas's death, the house felt alive again. The baby responded to her improved mood with gentle movements, as if sensing that something fundamental had shifted in their circumstances. She found herself humming an old hymn her mother had taught her, a melody about grace appearing in unexpected forms. The ride to Elias's ranch proved more challenging than she'd anticipated. At 7 months pregnant, even the gentle motion of the wagon seat left her breathless, and by the time she reached his property line, she was questioning the wisdom of the journey. But the pie sat beside her, wrapped in her best kitchen towel, and retreat seemed impossible now that she'd come so far. The Crow Ranch impressed her with its quiet prosperity. Everything spoke of careful attention and patient investment. Fences that ran straight and true, buildings maintained with obvious pride, livestock that looked healthy despite the harsh conditions. It was the kind of place Thomas had dreamed their farm might become, given time and luck and better weather. Elias emerged from the barn as her wagon approached, wiping his hands on a rag and squinting against the afternoon sun. He moved with the unhurried gait of a man comfortable in his own space, but she caught the moment of surprise that crossed his features when he recognized her. Clearly he hadn't expected visitors, especially not the woman he'd so recently rescued. "Mrs. Garner," he said, approaching the wagon with cautious courtesy. "This is, unexpected. You shouldn't be traveling in your condition." "It's Willa," she replied, accepting his hand as he helped her down from the wagon seat. His touch was brief but steady, and she noticed the calluses that spoke of honest work. "And I couldn't rest easy without properly thanking you for what you've done." She retrieved the pie from the wagon, suddenly self-conscious about her humble offering. What was apple pie to a man who owned hundreds of acres and a house that could shelter 3 families? But Elias's expression shifted when he saw what she carried, his usual stoic mask giving way to something almost vulnerable. "You didn't need to," he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with words that wanted to come but couldn't find their way out. "That is, I appreciate the gesture, but it wasn't necessary." "It was necessary for me," Willa said firmly, extending the pie toward him. A debt like mine can't go unacknowledged. My mother always said that kindness unpaid spoils the giver as much as the receiver. Elias accepted the pie with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly, as if he were receiving something far more precious than baked goods. When he looked up from the offering, his eyes held a warmth she hadn't seen before, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "Would you, that is, if you're not in a hurry to get back?" He gestured toward his porch, where 2 chairs sat, facing the endless horizon. "The afternoon's pleasant enough for sitting, and you shouldn't make the return journey until you've rested." It was the longest speech she'd heard him make, and the invitation, however awkwardly delivered, carried genuine desire for her company. Willa found herself nodding before she'd consciously decided to accept, drawn by something in his manner that suggested loneliness as deep as her own. As they settled onto the porch chairs, the pie resting on a small table between them, Willa realized this was the first time since Thomas's death that she'd felt truly welcome in another person's presence. Word traveled fast in a town the size of Cedar Ridge, and by Sunday morning, everyone knew about Willa Garner's miraculous salvation and the mysterious circumstances surrounding it. The congregation at First Methodist buzzed with whispered speculation as they filed into the white-steepled church, their voices mixing with the creaking of wooden pews and the rustle of Sunday-best clothing. Martha Sullivan had appointed herself Willa's unofficial protector, positioning her considerable bulk between her friend and the more gossipy members of the congregation. But even Martha's fierce loyalty couldn't shield Willa from the sideways glances and meaningful looks that followed her down the center aisle. She felt exposed, like a specimen under glass, every aspect of her situation subject to public examination and judgment. "Mighty convenient, that rancher showing up just when she needed saving," whispered Prudence Whitmore, Samuel's sharp-tongued wife, to her circle of equally sharp-tongued friends. "Makes a person wonder what arrangements might have been made beforehand." The implication hung in the air like incense, smoky and poisonous. In a community where reputation mattered more than money, suggestions of impropriety could destroy a woman faster than any scandal. Willa kept her eyes fixed on the altar, her hands folded protectively over her swollen belly, trying to ignore the weight of speculation that pressed down on her like summer heat. After the service, as the congregation lingered outside to exchange pleasantries and gossip, Willa found herself increasingly isolated. Women who had previously offered sympathy now maintained careful distance, as if her good fortune might be contagious in ways they preferred to avoid. Their children were pulled closer when they wandered too near, and conversations died when she approached. It was then that she noticed the envelope tucked under her wagon seat, a piece of paper folded and wedged where only she would find it. With trembling fingers, she extracted the anonymous message, her heart sinking as she read the crude handwriting. "Decent women don't take charity from strange men. Some gifts come with prices decent folk can't pay. Best remember your husband's memory before it's too late." The letter was unsigned, but its meaning was crystal clear. Someone in town believed her acceptance of Elias's help compromised her moral standing, and they wanted her to know that people were watching, judging, waiting for her to stumble. The cruelty of it took her breath away, that in her moment of greatest need, when a kind stranger had offered salvation, others would twist that kindness into something sordid. Martha appeared at her elbow, taking one look at Willa's pale face and the paper in her hands. Without a word, she plucked the letter away and read it herself, her expression darkening with each word. When she finished, she crumpled the paper in her substantial fist and dropped it into the dust. "Cowards," Martha declared loudly enough for nearby eavesdroppers to hear. "Takes a special kind of yellow belly to send poison pen letters to a pregnant widow. Some folks got nothing better to do than spread misery like seeds in winter." But the damage was done. As Willa drove home alone, the letter's words echoed in her mind like a funeral dirge. She'd been naive to think that accepting Elias's help would come without consequences. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, her association with the mysterious rancher would be dissected and judged until truth became indistinguishable from speculation. The worst part was the seed of doubt the letter planted. She barely knew Elias Crow, had no understanding of his motives or expectations. What if the gossips were right? What if his kindness came with strings attached, obligations she couldn't fulfill? The thought made her stomach churn with something beyond morning sickness. That evening, as she sat alone in her kitchen with Thomas's wedding ring heavy around her neck, Willa wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. How much was her independence worth? Could she continue accepting help from a man whose intentions remained unclear? And most troubling of all, why did the thought of cutting ties with Elias Crow fill her with a loneliness deeper than any she'd known since Thomas's death? Outside her window, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising either blessed rain or destructive wind. Like everything else in her life lately, the approaching weather carried both hope and threat in equal measure. Willa woke to the sound of hammering, rhythmic and purposeful, coming from somewhere near the barn. Dawn had barely touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pearl and rose, but someone was already at work on her property. She struggled from bed, her pregnancy making even simple movements an effort, and peered through her bedroom window to investigate the source of the early morning industry. Elias stood in her barnyard, stripped to his shirt sleeves, despite the morning chill, methodically replacing the broken fence posts that had been listing like drunken soldiers for months. His horse was tethered nearby, and a wagon loaded with lumber and tools suggested he'd come prepared for serious work. He moved with practiced efficiency, each swing of his hammer purposeful and precise, transforming her neglected property one post at a time. The sight filled her with conflicting emotions. Gratitude warred with embarrassment. She was grateful for the help, but mortified that her circumstances were so obviously desperate. Independence wrestled with practicality. She needed the assistance, but hated being seen as helpless. And underneath it all ran a current of something warmer, a recognition that Elias had appeared not because she'd asked, but because he'd seen a need and chosen to fill it. By the time she'd dressed and made her way outside, Elias had completed nearly half the fence line. He looked up as she approached, touching the brim of his hat in greeting, but continuing his work without pause. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air, and she could see the muscles in his shoulders working beneath the thin cotton of his shirt. "Morning," he said simply, as if finding him doing her chores was the most natural thing in the world. "Hope the hammering didn't wake you. Wanted to get started early before the heat builds up." "You don't need to," Willa began, then stopped, recognizing the futility of the protest. The fence clearly needed repair. She was in no condition to do it herself, and he was already 3/4 finished. "That is, I appreciate the help, but I can't keep accepting your charity." Elias paused in his hammering, studying her with those grey eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "Not charity," he said finally. "Good fences make for good neighbours. This benefits both our properties." It was a polite fiction, and they both knew it. His own fences were in perfect repair, maintained with the care of a man who understood that details mattered. But the lie was kindly meant, allowing her to accept his help without feeling completely powerless. As the morning progressed, Willa found herself drawn into the rhythm of his work. She couldn't contribute much physically, but she could fetch tools, hold board steady, and provide the small assists that made his job easier. They worked mostly in silence, but it was a comfortable quiet, punctuated by brief exchanges about technique or materials. When they reached the corner post near the barn, Elias discovered rot that went deeper than surface appearance suggested. The entire section would need rebuilding, a job that required precision and patience. He studied the problem with the thoughtful attention of a craftsman, then began the careful work of excavation and replacement. "Thomas started this project," Willa said quietly, watching him work. "He said good fences were the foundation of good farming. Never got the chance to finish it." Elias's hands stilled for a moment, and when he resumed work, his movements carried extra care, as if he understood he was completing another man's vision. "Seems like a man who knew what he was doing," he said. "Foundations solid, just needed someone to carry on where he left off." The repaired fence post stood straight and true when he finished, anchored deep and braced against whatever storms might come. Looking at it, Willa felt something shift inside her chest. Not guilt at seeing another man complete her husband's work, but gratitude that Thomas's plans were finally being realized. The post represented more than property maintenance. It was a bridge between past and future, between loss and hope. That evening, as Elias packed his tools and prepared to leave, the fence line stood complete and strong, ready to withstand whatever challenges the prairie might bring, and Willa found herself hoping he'd find another excuse to return. The carved wooden bird appeared on Willa's porch rail 3 days after the fence repair, perched there as if it had simply decided to rest during a long migration. She discovered it while hanging laundry, the morning sun catching the delicate details that brought the simple piece of wood to life. Someone had spent considerable time shaping each feather, each curve of wing and beak, transforming an ordinary chunk of pine into something beautiful and alive. No note accompanied the gift, but Willa knew instinctively who had left it there. The craftsmanship spoke of patient hands and careful attention to detail, qualities she'd observed in everything Elias touched. But more than that, the bird carried a gentleness that revealed something about its creator, a tenderness hidden beneath layers of silence and solitude. She lifted the carving carefully, surprised by its lightness and the smoothness of wood worn soft by countless hours of handling. This wasn't a recent creation, but something that had lived in someone's pocket or on someone's shelf, touched and treasured before being passed on to her. The thought that Elias had given her something precious to him, something he'd kept close, made her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. That afternoon, when he appeared again to check his fence repairs and inspect the corners for settling, Willa was ready for him. She'd spent the morning baking bread, and the warm loaves sat cooling on her kitchen table, filling the house with the yeasty scent of comfort and home. It was becoming a pattern between them. His quiet appearances to tend her property, her small offerings of food and hospitality in return. "Thank you for the bird," she said as he examined a fence post with unnecessary thoroughness. "It's beautiful. I've put it on my mantel where I can see it from the kitchen." Elias's hands stilled on the post, and she saw colour rise in his neck. Above his collar. "Seemed like something you might like," he said without looking at her. "House could use some cheerfulness." The admission revealed more than he'd probably intended. That he'd thought about her house, considered what might bring her pleasure, suggested a consideration that went beyond neighbourly duty. She found herself studying his profile as he worked, noting the way afternoon light caught the silver threads in his dark hair and the lines that spoke of years spent squinting against prairie sun and wind. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" she asked, surprising herself with the boldness of the invitation. "I've got fresh bread, and it seems silly to keep talking across a fence post." The pause that followed stretched long enough for her to question the wisdom of the offer. Elias straightened slowly, his grey eyes meeting hers with an expression she couldn't quite read. Uncertainty, longing, fear, perhaps all three warred in the silence between them. "Wouldn't be proper," he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "Folks in town already talk enough without adding fuel to their fire." "Let them talk," Willa replied, with a firmness that surprised them both. "I'm tired of living my life according to other people's opinions. You've shown me more kindness than anyone else in this county. The least I can do is offer you a cup of coffee in my own kitchen." Something shifted in his expression then, walls cracking just enough to let light through. He glanced toward the road, empty except for dust devils and distant heat shimmer, then back at her face. Whatever he saw there seemed to tip some internal balance in her favor. "Just coffee," he said, as if the clarification were for his own. benefit as much as hers. Her kitchen welcomed them with warmth and the lingering scent of fresh bread. As Willa bustled about preparing coffee and slicing still warm loaves, she was acutely aware of Elias's presence. How he removed his hat respectfully, how his large frame seemed to fill the space, how carefully he chose where to sit as if afraid of presuming too much. When she placed the carved bird in the center of the table between them, it seemed to bridge whatever distance remained. A reminder of the unexpected gift that had started this tentative dance towards something neither of them was quite ready to name. The evening arrived unexpected and golden, one of those rare prairie sunsets that painted the entire world in shades of amber and rose. Willa had been preparing a simple supper when she noticed Elias still working near the barn, his silhouette dark against the luminous sky. Without fully deciding to do so, she found herself calling out to him, her voice carrying across the yard with an invitation that surprised them both. "Mr. Crow, Elias, would you care to join me for supper? It's nothing fancy, just stew and cornbread, but there's more than enough for two." He straightened from whatever task had kept him busy, tools forgotten as he considered her offer. The silence stretched just long enough for her to wonder if she'd overstepped some invisible boundary, but then he was walking toward her, hat in hand, and something like gratitude softening his usually guarded features. They ate by the light of her kitchen lamp and the dying glow from the hearth, the intimate setting transforming a simple meal into something that felt almost ceremonial. The stew was rich with vegetables from her struggling garden, and the cornbread was golden and warm, but it was the conversation that truly nourished them both. "Tell me about Thomas," Elias said quietly, his request carrying the weight of genuine interest rather than polite inquiry. What kind of man was he? The question should have been painful, but instead, Willa found herself smiling as memories surfaced like flowers after rain. He was the kind of man who talked to plants while he worked in the garden, convinced they grew better with encouragement. He used to tell the corn it was going to be the finest crop Kansas had ever seen, whether it looked promising or not. Elias listened with the focused attention of someone storing away every detail, and she found herself sharing stories she hadn't told anyone since Thomas's death. How he'd sung off-key while doing chores, how he'd carved their initials in the E. Oak tree by the well, how he'd spent their last Christmas morning reading aloud from Dickens while she cooked breakfast. "He sounds like a good man," Elias said when she finished, his voice carrying something deeper than polite acknowledgement, the kind who deserved to see his child grow up. "Yes," Willa agreed, one hand instinctively moving to her belly where the baby stirred in response to her emotion. He was so excited about becoming a father. He'd already started planning fishing trips and riding lessons, talking about teaching our son or daughter everything he knew about the land. The shared meal stretched into something neither had experienced in longer than they cared to remember. Companionship without agenda, conversation without pretense. As full darkness settled around them and the lamp cast dancing shadows on the walls, they moved to sit before the fireplace, where glowing embers provided both warmth and intimate lighting. "What about you?" Willa asked, emboldened by the wine-dark hour and the sense that usual rules had been suspended. "Were you ever married? Did you ever want children?" The question hit something vulnerable in Elias's expression, and for a moment she thought he might retreat behind his usual silence. But the evening seemed to have cast its own spell, creating a space where honesty felt not only possible, but necessary. "Once," he said finally, his voice so quiet she had to lean forward to hear, "before the war, had plans, just like any young a man, but war changes things, changes a man. When I came back," he paused, struggling with words that wanted to stay buried. "Wasn't fit for the kind of life she deserved. Still ain't, truth be told." The admission hung between them like a bridge. Neither was quite ready to cross. Willa studied his profile in the firelight, seeing not the successful rancher others knew, but the wounded soldier who'd never quite found his way home from whatever battlefield still haunted his dreams. Without conscious thought, she reached across the small space separating them and placed her hand gently over his. The contact was brief, barely a moment's touch, but it carried the weight of understanding and acceptance that words couldn't convey. When Elias finally rose to leave, the evening felt like a shared meal by firelight had somehow nourished parts of them both that had been starving in silence. The legal document arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a nervous-looking clerk who barely waited for Willa's signature before hurrying back to town. The official seal of the county courthouse made the envelope feel heavy as stone in her hands, and she knew, before opening it, that Samuel Whitmore had found new ways to make her life difficult. Inside, legal language wound through multiple pages like a snake through tall grass, but the meaning was clear enough once she passed through the elaborate phrasing. Whitmore was challenging the validity of the deed transfer, claiming irregularities in the process and demanding a formal review by the county court. He alleged that proper notification procedures hadn't been followed, that the sale price was suspiciously above market value, and that the entire transaction bore hallmarks of fraud designed to circumvent legitimate banking practices. The allegations were serious enough to cloud the title until resolved, potentially freezing any improvements to the property and certainly casting doubt on her legal right to remain there. Worse, the document hinted at broader investigations into Elias's finances and business practices, suggesting that helping her might cost him far more than the money he'd spent on her behalf. Willa sank into her kitchen chair, the baby kicking restlessly, as if sensing her distress. The brief period of security and hope that had followed Elias's intervention was crumbling like a sandcastle before an incoming tide. Whitmore wasn't content to accept his defeat gracefully. He was determined to punish both her and her unlikely savior for daring to thwart his plans. That afternoon, Martha Sullivan arrived with flour and indignation in equal measure, having heard about the legal challenge through the town's efficient gossip network. She bustled around Willa's kitchen with the purposeful energy of a woman preparing for battle, her substantial frame radiating protective fury. "That snake Whitmore's been bragging all over town about how he's going to sort this mess out proper," Martha declared, rolling out pie dough with more force than necessary. "Says he's got friends in the county courthouse who understand the importance of maintaining legal standards. Makes my blood boil, the way he's twisting this into some grand crusade for justice." The implications were clear enough. Whitmore had connections and influence that a pregnant widow and a reclusive rancher couldn't match. He could afford to drag the case through the courts for months, bleeding them both financially, while maintaining the comfortable fiction that he was simply upholding the law. "What does Doc Henley say about all this?" Willa asked, knowing that the physician often served as the community's unofficial voice of reason during disputes. Martha's expression grew even grimmer. "Doc's worried, honey. Says Whitmore's been talking to people about your association with Mr. Crow, making implications about the nature of his interest in helping you, suggesting that maybe the deed transfer was payment for services that decent folks don't talk about in polite company." The accusation hit Willa like a physical blow, stealing her breath and sending heat rushing to her cheeks. That Whitmore would stoop to destroying her reputation to achieve his goals shouldn't have surprised her, but the calculated cruelty of it still shocked her. In a community where a woman's standing depended entirely on others' perception of her moral character, such rumors could destroy her more effectively than any legal maneuver. "He can't prove what isn't true," Willa said, but her voice lacked conviction. In small towns, proof mattered less than perception, and once planted, seeds of scandal grew quickly in fertile gossip. "Truth's got nothing to do with it," Martha replied grimly. "Whitmore's counting on folks being ready to believe the worst, especially about a situation they don't understand. Man like Elias Crow doesn't usually go around rescuing widows without wanting something in return. Least that's how people think. That evening, as Willa sat alone with the legal documents spread across her kitchen table, she wrestled with impossible choices. She could fight the challenge and risk dragging Elias into a scandal that might destroy them both. She could surrender the deed and accept whatever fate awaited her and her unborn child. Or she could find some middle ground that satisfied Whitmore's greed while preserving what remained of her dignity. None of the options offered anything resembling victory, and all of them required sacrifices she wasn't sure she was strong enough to make. Elias arrived the next morning with storm clouds gathering both in the sky and in his expression. Word of Whitmore's legal challenge had reached him, along with the whispered accusations that followed in its wake. He stood in Willa's doorway like a man preparing for battle, his jaw set and his grey eyes darker than the approaching weather. "We need to talk," he said without preamble, his voice carrying a gravity that made her heart race with apprehension. "About what this is going to cost, and whether you're prepared to pay it." They sat at her kitchen table, with the legal documents between them like a declaration of war. Outside, the first fat raindrops began to spatter against the windows, and thunder rumbled in the distance like artillery. The storm that had been threatening for days was finally arriving, bringing with it the confrontation Willa had been dreading. "I know what people are saying," she began, but Elias cut her off with a sharp gesture. Do you really understand what Whitmore's trying to do here?" His voice carried an edge she'd never heard before, frustration mixed with something that might have been fear. "He's not just challenging the deed. He's trying to destroy both our reputations, make it so neither of us can show our faces in this county again." Willa met his gaze steadily, surprised by her own calm in the face of his agitation. "Then why did you do it? Why risk everything for someone you barely know?" The question hung between them like lightning before thunder, charged with implications neither had been willing to voice. Elias's composure cracked, revealing something raw and vulnerable beneath his usual control. "Because I couldn't let you lose everything," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Because watching you face that eviction alone was like watching—" He stopped, struggling with words that wanted to come but carried too much weight. "Like watching something beautiful being destroyed while I stood by and did nothing." The admission shattered whatever careful distance they'd maintained. Willa felt tears gathering in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming recognition of being truly seen, truly valued, by someone who asked nothing in return. "Elias," she said softly, reaching across the table to touch his hand. This time he didn't pull away, and she could feel the tremor in his fingers, the barely contained emotion that made him seem suddenly fragile despite his size and strength. "I've got something to show you," he said after a long moment, rising from the table with the careful movements of a man carrying a heavy burden. He went to his coat and withdrew a folded paper, worn soft from handling and yellowed with age. "Been carrying this since the war, never showed it to another living soul." The letter was written in a familiar hand, though it took Willa a moment to recognize Thomas's careful script. As she read, her world shifted on its axis, rearranging itself around truths she'd never suspected. "My dearest friend Elias," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then the fever has taken me, as we both feared it would. I need you to know that my last thoughts were not of my own suffering, but of the woman I'm leaving behind. Willa is the finest person I've ever known, but she's gentle in ways this hard country doesn't forgive. She'll need someone strong enough to protect her, patient enough to earn her trust, and good enough to deserve her love. I know I'm asking the impossible, but if there's any way you could watch over her, see that she's safe, I'd count it the greatest kindness one friend could do for another." The letter continued, but Willa's vision blurred with tears that made reading impossible. When she looked up, Elias was watching her with an expression of such naked vulnerability that she felt her heart break and heal simultaneously. "He knew you," she whispered. "He wrote to you about me." "More than that," Elias replied, his voice rough with emotion. He loved you enough to trust me with the most precious thing in his world, and I loved him enough to try to be worthy of that trust. Outside, rain began to fall in earnest, washing the dusty world clean and filling the air with the scent of renewal and hope. The rain drummed steadily against the windows as Elias sat across from Willa. Thomas's letter still spread. Between them, like a bridge across years of silence, something had broken open in him, and words that had been locked away for decades began to flow like water through a broken dam. "We met at a recruitment station in Missouri," he began, his voice carrying the careful cadence of a man telling a story he'd never shared. Two farm boys who thought war was going to be an adventure. Thomas was 18, same as me, but he had this way of seeing the best in everything, even when we were marching through mud and sleeping in the rain. Willa listened without interruption, understanding that this confession had been building for years and couldn't be rushed or redirected. Outside, lightning illuminated the prairie in stark black and white, and thunder followed like the echo of old cannons. "He saved my life at Antietam," Elias continued, his fingers tracing the edge of the worn letter. "Took a bullet meant for. Me spent 3 weeks in a field hospital while I sat beside his bed wondering how I was going to live with the debt. When he finally pulled through, he acted like it was nothing, said that's what friends do for each other." From his coat pocket, Elias withdrew a small leather portfolio, its surface cracked and stained from years of careful preservation. Inside were his military discharge papers, the official documentation of his service with the 5th Kansas Volunteer Infantry. But it wasn't the formal language of military bureaucracy that made Willa's breath catch. It was the notation at the bottom, written in a different hand: "Recommended for Medal of Honor, declined by request of recipient." "I couldn't accept it," Elias said, noticing her surprise. Felt wrong taking recognition for something Thomas should have shared. He was the brave one, always putting himself between danger and anyone who needed protection. I was just trying not to get killed and get home in one piece. The rain outside intensified, turning the world beyond the windows into a grey blur that seemed to mirror the emotional storm breaking inside the small kitchen. Willa studied the discharge papers, trying to reconcile the modest man before her with the decorated soldier these documents described. "After the war, I couldn't settle," Elias admitted. "Tried going back to Missouri, tried starting over in Colorado, but nothing felt right. Everywhere I went, I carried the weight of things I'd seen, friends I'd lost. Thomas was the only one who understood what it was like, coming home to a world that expected you to just forget and move on." He paused, lost in memories that clearly still had the power to wound. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of old guilt and newer understanding. "When Thomas wrote about moving to Kansas, about finding land and starting fresh, it seemed like maybe we could help each other heal. He had dreams enough for both of us, and I had money saved from my army pay. We were going to be neighbors, build something good together. But you never came," Willa said gently, beginning to understand the shape of his isolation. "Got as far as Topeka and lost my nerve," Elias confessed. "Convinced myself I'd bring nothing but trouble to his new life. He had you by then, had written about falling in love and planning to marry. Seemed selfish to show up with my shadows and silence when he was finally finding happiness." The discharge papers lay on the table between them, evidence of service and sacrifice that had never been properly honored. Willa looked at the man across from her, successful rancher, decorated veteran, loyal friend, and saw clearly for the first time the boy who had gone to war and never quite made it home. "So you watched from a distance," she said, understanding flooding through her like warm rain after drought. "For 2 years," Elias nodded. "Told myself I was protecting him from what I'd become. But when the fever took him," his voice broke slightly, "I realized I'd wasted 2 years we could have had as friends, as brothers. And then it was too late for everything except trying to honor the promise I'd never actually made." Outside, the storm began to move on, leaving behind the clean scent of washed earth and the promise of new growth. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and electric with possibility, when Elias reached into his coat one final time. His movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, as he withdrew an envelope that bore clear signs of having been opened and refolded countless times. The paper was different from his discharge papers, newer but worn soft from handling, with Thomas's distinctive handwriting across the front. "There's more," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a man about to reveal his deepest secret. "Something Thomas wrote just before he died. Something I should have shown you from the beginning." Willa's heart hammered against her ribs as she recognized the envelope. It was addressed to her in Thomas's careful script, but the seal had been broken long ago. Her hands trembled as she accepted it, understanding instinctively that whatever it contained would change everything between them. The letter inside was dated just 3 days before Thomas's death, written in the shaky hand of a man fighting fever, but determined to communicate something vital. As Willa read, the world around her seemed to shift and realign, like pieces of a puzzle finally falling into proper order. "My beloved Willa," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then the fever has claimed me, as we both feared it might. I need you to know that my friend Elias Crow will come to you soon. Do not be surprised by this, and do not turn him away. He is the finest man I have ever known, though he would never claim such distinction for himself." Willa's breath caught as the full implications of Thomas's words became clear. This wasn't a letter asking Elias to watch over her. It was a letter preparing her for Elias's arrival, written by a dying man who had orchestrated their meeting from beyond the grave. "Elias saved my life during the war, but more than that, he saved my soul. When I came home broken and angry, it was his letters that reminded me there was still goodness in the world worth fighting for. When I met you, I wrote to tell him I had found the woman I wanted to share my life with, and his response was so full of joy for my happiness that I knew he was a man who could be trusted with everything precious to me." The letter continued, each word hitting Willa like a revelation. "I have asked him to look after you should anything happen to me, but I hope for something more. Elias carries wounds from the war that have never properly healed, and he has convinced himself that he is unworthy of the kind of love and family that every good man deserves. But you, my darling, have the gift of seeing past surface scars to the goodness underneath. If fate should bring you together, do not let his protests or his guilt prevent you from recognizing what I have long known, that he is capable of loving you as completely as any woman has ever been loved." Willa's vision blurred with tears as she read Thomas's final paragraphs. "I do not ask you to forget me or to love him in my place. I ask only that you allow yourself to be happy, to find love again, if love should find you. Elias will resist such happiness, believing himself unworthy of it, but you have the strength to show him otherwise. In loving him, you would honor my memory more than any amount of mourning ever could." The letter was signed with Thomas's familiar flourish, but beneath his signature was a postscript that made Willa's heart stop. "P.S. I have given Elias my war medal to present to you when the time is right. It represents the brotherhood we shared and the trust I place in him to care for what I hold most dear." Elias was watching her face as she read, his expression a mixture of hope and terror. When she finished, he reached into his pocket one more time and withdrew a small wooden box. Inside, nestled in faded silk, lay Thomas's Medal of Honor, the decoration he had never mentioned, the recognition he had earned but kept private. "He never told me," Willa whispered, touching the medal with reverent fingers. "He never said he was a hero. He was too modest to see himself that way," Elias replied. "But he was the bravest man I ever knew, and not just in war. It takes courage to love someone enough to want them to find happiness even after you're gone." The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility and weighted with the enormity of Thomas's revelation. He had known he was dying, and he had used his final days to orchestrate not just Elias's care for Willa, but the possibility of their love. It was matchmaking from the grave, executed with the same careful planning Thomas had brought to everything he touched. "He planned this," Willa said, wonder and shock warring in her voice. "All of it. He wanted us to find each other." The revelation of Thomas's orchestrated matchmaking hung between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross. Willa stared at the medal in her hands, its weight somehow representing both Thomas's love and the impossible burden of living up to his expectations. The magnitude of what her husband had planned, the careful manipulation of events, even as he lay dying, left her reeling with emotions too complex to untangle. "He had no right," she said finally, her voice tight with anger that surprised them both. "Thomas had no right to make such decisions for us, to arrange our lives like pieces on a chessboard." Elias recoiled as if she'd struck him, the hope that had been building in his expression crumbling into something much more familiar, guilt and self-recrimination. "You're right," he said quietly, reaching for his hat. "I should never have presumed—" "Don't," Willa cut him off, her own confusion making her voice sharper than she intended. "Don't you dare turn this into another reason to punish yourself. This isn't about your worthiness or my availability. This is about Thomas thinking he could control our emotions from beyond the grave." She rose from the table with effort, her pregnancy making the movement awkward, but her agitation demanded motion. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, too confining, for the storm of feelings battling inside her chest. Love for Thomas warred with fury at his presumption. Gratitude for Elias's care fought against resentment at being manipulated. Attraction struggled with guilt over feeling anything beyond. "Friendship for another man. He loved you," Elias said, his voice carrying the patience of a man accustomed to absorbing others' anger. "Everything he did came from love." "Love doesn't give someone the right to make choices for other people," Willa replied, pacing as much as her condition allowed. "I mourned him, Elias. I grieved properly and completely. I was finally beginning to heal, to imagine a future that didn't revolve around loss. And now I discover that even my healing was part of his plan." The words hung in the air like accusations, though neither was sure who was being accused. Thomas for his elaborate orchestration, Elias for following those orchestrations, or Willa herself for responding exactly as Thomas had predicted she would. "Did you know?" she asked suddenly, turning to face Elias with eyes that demanded absolute honesty. "When you helped me, when you spent time here, when you—" She gestured vaguely at the intimacy they'd been building. "Did you know about the letter?" "Not all of it," Elias admitted, his integrity preventing any comfortable lies. "I knew he'd asked me to watch over you. I knew he wanted me to make sure you were safe. But the rest, about encouraging something between us, about wanting us to find love, I didn't know that until recently." "How recently?" The question came out like a demand. "The day I gave you the deed," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I found the letter that morning, hidden with his medal, read it 3 times before I understood what he was really asking of me." The admission hit Willa like a physical blow. Every kindness, every moment of connection, every gentle gesture had been tainted by knowledge she hadn't possessed. While she'd been discovering genuine feelings, he'd been following a dead man's instructions. "So all of this," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "every conversation, every meal, every moment we've shared, it was all just you fulfilling an obligation to Thomas?" "No," Elias said urgently, rising from his chair as if to physically bridge the distance growing between them. "It started that way, maybe, but it became something else. What I feel for you—" He stopped, struggling with words that felt too large and dangerous to speak aloud. "What you feel for me was suggested by my dead husband," Willa finished, her tone cutting despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "How am I supposed to trust any of it? How am I supposed to know what's real and what's just you trying to be the man Thomas wanted you to be?" The silence that followed felt final, like a door closing on possibilities that had never really existed. Thomas's war medal lay forgotten on the table between them, its bronze surface reflecting the lamplight like judgment. Outside, the last of the storm clouds moved away, taking with them any hope that the weather might provide an excuse for Elias to stay longer. "I should go," he said finally, reaching for his coat with movements that spoke of a man who had lost something precious before he'd ever really possessed it. "Yes," Willa agreed, though the word felt like swallowing glass. "I think you should." As Elias walked toward the door, Thomas's medal caught the light one more time, its gleaming surface a reminder of brotherhood, sacrifice, and the dangerous presumption that love could be orchestrated like a military campaign. 3 days passed in a silence that felt more complete than death. Willa moved through her daily routines like a woman walking underwater, every action requiring conscious effort and deliberate thought. The baby inside her seemed to sense her distress, kicking restlessly and making sleep impossible. She found herself talking to the child, one hand resting on her swollen belly as she tried to explain emotions too complex for her own understanding. "Your papa was a good man," she whispered during the long, dark hours before dawn. "But good. Men sometimes make mistakes, even when they're trying to help. And now, Mama has to figure out how to live with the consequences of his love." The carved wooden bird still sat on her mantle, catching the morning light and reminding her of gentleness she wasn't sure she could trust anymore. Every time she looked at it, she wondered if Elias had given it to her because he wanted to, or because Thomas's letter had suggested such gestures would win her heart. The uncertainty poisoned even her most cherished memories of their growing connection. Martha Sullivan arrived on Thursday morning with provisions and the grim news that Whitmore was pressing his legal challenge with renewed vigor. Word had spread about the confrontation between Willa and Elias, and the banker was using their apparent estrangement as evidence that the deed transfer had been improper from the beginning. "He's saying that if the arrangement was legitimate, you two wouldn't be having difficulties now," Martha reported, her substantial frame radiating indignation as she unpacked supplies. "Claims that proper business relationships don't fall apart over personal disagreements." The logic was twisted but effective. In a community where everyone knew everyone else's business, the sudden cooling between Willa and Elias provided ammunition for those who wanted to believe the worst about their association. Whitmore was using their heartbreak as evidence of corruption, turning their pain into legal strategy. "Doc Henley's worried about you," Martha continued, studying Willa's pale complexion and the shadows under her eyes. "Says a woman in your condition shouldn't be carrying this kind of stress. Bad for you and bad for the baby." That afternoon, as if summoned by their conversation, Doc Henley arrived with his black medical bag and the weary expression of a man who'd seen too much suffering. His examination was gentle but thorough, and his conclusions were delivered with the blunt honesty that made him trusted throughout the county. "Your blood pressure is elevated, and the baby's positioning suggests you're closer to delivery than we initially calculated," he said, packing his instruments with practiced efficiency. "Under normal circumstances, I'd recommend complete bed. Rest for the remainder of your pregnancy. But these aren't normal circumstances, are they?" The question carried weight beyond medical concern. Doc Henley had been present at too many births, witnessed too many family crises, to miss the signs of emotional turmoil that could complicate even routine deliveries. He'd seen strong women brought low by stress, and he wasn't about to let Willa become another casualty of other people's conflicts. "You need to resolve this situation," he said firmly. "Whether that means fighting Whitmore's challenge or finding some other solution, you can't continue living in this state of uncertainty. Your body won't tolerate it much longer." That evening, as Willa sat alone in her kitchen contemplating impossible choices, She heard the unmistakable sound of multiple horses approaching her property. Through her window, she could see lanterns bobbing in the darkness and the silhouettes of several men on horseback. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she recognized Whitmore's voice among the others. Though she couldn't make out the words, the delegation that approached her porch was impressive in its official authority. Whitmore had brought Sheriff Davies, County Clerk Morrison, and two men she didn't recognize, but whose Eastern clothing suggested they were the railroad investors she'd heard whispered about. In the lamplight, their faces carried the grim satisfaction of men who believed they held all the advantages. "Mrs. Garner," Whitmore said with false courtesy, removing his hat as he approached her door. "We apologize for the late hour, but urgent business requires immediate attention. We have documents that need your signature." The papers he produced were thick with legal language, but their meaning was clear enough. A settlement offer that would void the original deed transfer, compensate Elias for his investment, and transfer the property to Whitmore's railroad associates for a sum that would allow Willa to relocate somewhere far from Cedar Ridge. "It's a generous offer," one of the Eastern men said, his voice carrying the smooth authority of someone accustomed to closing deals. "More than enough for a fresh start in a city where opportunities for a woman in your situation would be considerably better." The implication was unmistakable. Take the money and disappear, or face a legal battle she couldn't win and public scandal she couldn't survive. They were offering her a way out that preserved everyone's dignity while giving them what they wanted: her land and her absence. In her bedroom drawer, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, lay the loaded shotgun Thomas had taught her to use for protection against prairie wolves and other predators. As she looked at the men on her porch, their faces hard with determination and their intentions clear as moonlight, Willa realized that some predators walked on two legs and wore business suits. The time for passive acceptance was over. Whatever happened next would require her to fight for what mattered most, not just her land, but her right to choose her own future. Willa's refusal to sign the settlement papers hung in the night air like a challenge thrown down before armed men. The delegation on her porch exchanged glances that spoke of contingency plans and escalating pressure, while she stood in her doorway with one hand resting protectively on her swollen belly and the other gripping the doorframe for support. "I'm afraid you don't understand the gravity of your situation, Mrs. Garner," Whitmore said, his false courtesy evaporating like morning dew. "This offer represents your only reasonable option. The alternative is a legal battle you cannot win and scandal that will follow you wherever you go." That's when the first labor pain hit her, sharp and unmistakable, doubling her over with its intensity. The baby, as if sensing the threat to their sanctuary, had decided this moment of maximum crisis was the perfect time to make its entrance into the world. Willa gasped, her knees nearly buckling as the contraction gripped her body like a giant. "Fist, something's wrong," Sheriff Davies said, his lawman's instincts overriding his business obligations. "Ma'am, are you—" "The baby's coming," Willa managed between gritted teeth, understanding with crystal clarity that the next few hours would determine not just her child's future, but her own survival. "You need to fetch Doc Henley, now." The men on her porch suddenly found themselves transformed from aggressive negotiators into reluctant midwives, their carefully planned confrontation derailed by the simple biological fact that babies arrive on their own schedule. As another contraction seized her, Willa heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats, fast and urgent, carrying a rider who seemed to be racing against time itself. Elias appeared out of the darkness, like an answer to prayers she hadn't dared voice. He took in the scene at a glance. Willa doubled over in labor, the delegation of men looking increasingly uncomfortable, and the sense of crisis that hung over. Everything like smoke from a prairie fire. Without hesitation, he dismounted and pushed through the group to reach her side. "I heard voices," he said simply, his strong arm supporting her weight as another contraction began. "Figured you might need help. This is a private matter," Whitmore protested, but his voice lacked its previous authority. Watching a woman in labor had a way of putting business concerns into stark perspective, and even railroad investors understood that some things took precedence over legal documents. "Sheriff," Elias said without taking his attention from Willa, "ride for Doc Henley. Tell him it's urgent. The rest of you can conduct your business after this baby's safely born." The authority in his voice brooked no argument. This was the decorated veteran speaking, the man who'd led soldiers through hell and brought them home alive. Sheriff Davies was already mounting his horse, grateful for clear orders that made sense, while the other men retreated to a respectful distance. Through the next several hours, as labor progressed with the relentless rhythm of nature asserting itself, the petty concerns of deeds and land ownership seemed insignificant compared to the miracle unfolding in Willa's bedroom. Doc Henley arrived in time to guide the delivery, while Elias waited on the porch with the patience of a man who understood that some things couldn't be rushed. The baby's first cry pierced the pre-dawn darkness like a declaration of independence, announcing the arrival of a new life that would not be bound by the conflicts of the previous generation. When Doc Henley emerged with the news that both mother and child were healthy, the assembled men found themselves unexpectedly moved by the simple wonder of birth. In the soft light of early morning, as Willa held her son for the first time, she saw Thomas's gentle eyes looking back at her from the baby's face. But more than that, she saw the future, her son's future, and understood with absolute clarity what she needed to do to protect it. "Mr. Whitmore," she said when the delegation was finally allowed inside to pay their respects, her voice carrying the quiet strength of a woman who had just accomplished the most difficult thing in the world and survived it. "I'll be keeping my land. This baby deserves to grow up where his father planted roots, and I intend to see that he gets that chance." The railroad men muttered about legal challenges and continued pressure, but their hearts weren't in it anymore. Something about witnessing new life had taken the edge off their appetite for conquest. Whitmore himself seemed diminished, his schemes rendered petty by the presence of genuine miracle. As the delegation finally departed, Elias remained behind to help with the practical needs of a new mother and child. He worked quietly and efficiently, bringing water, tending the fire, and making himself useful without presuming anything about their relationship. When Willa finally asked him to hold the baby while she rested, he accepted the responsibility, with the reverence of a man being granted an unexpected blessing. "What will you name him?" Elias asked softly, studying the small face with wonder. Willa wrapped the child in the blanket she'd been knitting throughout her pregnancy. Soft wool, dyed blue with prairie flowers, a labor of love that had sustained her through the darkest months. "Thomas Elias Garner," she said, meeting his eyes with a smile that held both forgiveness and possibility. "After his father, and the man who helped bring him safely into the world." In that moment, surrounded by new life and endless prairie sky, the future stretched before them like an unwritten story, full of hope and second chances and the quiet promise that some love stories begin not with passion, but with patience.